Between 1692 and 1693, almost 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem village. Of those accused, 20 were officially executed. Of those executed, 14 were women and 6 were men. All of them were white. Hey gang, what are y'all doing back there? No matter. Welcome to this very first episode of this brand new YouTube channel in which we take a closer look at overlooked aspects of history. As hinted in that rather ominous intro, today we are going to be taking a closer look back at the infamous Salem witch trials. Based on popular depictions of the Salem witch trials, it's pretty easy to forget that Salem Village was in fact not a homogeneous community of just white Puritans. This was the 17th century, and as in most European colonies, enslaved people of African and indigenous origin played a vital role in the Salem village community. And in these historic witch trials, there was no one more pivotal than Tituba, a woman enslaved, one of the first 3 people to be accused of witchcraft in Salem. There's very little biographical information available on Tituba to shed light on her life before 1692, the year the witch trials began. In the judicial records of the trial, Tituba is described as a slave originating from the West Indies and probably practicing hoodoo. This reference to hoodoo, a spiritual practice, suggests a West African origin for Tituba. However, in court documents, Tituba is always described as an Indian woman, suggesting an indigenous Caribbean origin. The historian Elaine G. Breslaw, author of Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, posits that Tituba was Arawak, indigenous to the Caribbean. This is based on linguistic and etymological research regarding Tituba's name, and this theory that she's Arawak is widely supported by scholars today. However, this has had little influence on Tituba's depictions throughout history. In almost all media, she's depicted as black, of African descent. For example, in Anne Petry's 1964 novel, Tituba of Salem Village, the protagonist is a black woman from Barbados. In this novel, the repeated refrain is, "The slave must survive," and Tituba does whatever is necessary to beat accusations of witchcraft during a harsh New England winter. Petry's novel isn't the only one to cast Tituba as the protagonist. In I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, originally published in French, the novelist Maurice Condé envisions Tituba as the daughter of an enslaved African woman who was raped by a white man. In this novel, narrated by Tituba herself, Tituba is a witch. She has magical powers. The novel kind of dips in and out of possible realities, and it even features a conversation between Tituba and Hester from the Scarlet Letter. It's a really interesting book. I recommend checking it out. Meanwhile, there are depictions that are more widely known, like her portrayal in The Crucible by Arthur Miller. It's this depiction of Tituba as the sort of enabler and corrupter of young girls in Salem that has been most perpetuated throughout history. The historian Chadwick Hansen dates this switch in Tituba's identity to the late 19th century verse drama Giles Corey of the Salem Farms, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Here, Tituba is identified in the cast of characters as an Indian woman, but reveals herself to be the daughter of an Obi, a man black and fierce, reinforcing an African ancestry. Hansen theorizes that white writers subconsciously transitioned Tituba from an Indian to African identity due to racial prejudice. He writes, "It is surely significant that the racial metamorphosis occasioned by this prejudice began between the Civil War and the First World War, a period when ethnic hatreds in this country were at their most intense." According to Hansen, white writers apply more negative values to African identities than to indigenous American ones. They portray Tituba as black in an effort to make her appear more sinister or threatening. Though Hansen and Breslaw's theories are widely supported today, there are still scholars that would like us to take a more critical lens to this quest for Tituba's identity. For example, historian Veda Smith Tucker wants to remind us that the 17th century didn't have the same mutually exclusive racial categories. She suggests that the people of Salem could have viewed Tituba as both Indian and black, that Tituba could have a far more fluid identity. Tucker writes, "Unfortunately, what was a comfortable, practical conclusion for our Puritan predecessors remains an unsettling enigma for today's scholars, whose thinking is conditioned by modern racial mythologies. This suggests that contemporary thinkers laboring to extinguish Tituba's dual identities are as deceived by their own racial fictions as were the dogmatic denizens of the 17th century Salem village." In short, we've once again fallen victim to our own constructs of race. Putting this question of identity aside now, let's take a look at Tituba's actual role in the witch trials. In Salem, Tituba labored in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris. This guy. Parris was born in England and educated in Boston, but he moved to Barbados to oversee a plantation he inherited and to profit from the labor of enslaved people. When a hurricane devastated his plantation, Parris returned to Boston with his family, bringing Tituba and her husband John. In Boston, Parris decided that the life of a plantation owner didn't offer enough job security, so he became an ordained minister and was soon hired by the people of Salem to become the village minister. Yes, for reasons that are beyond me, the people of Salem hired an incompetent businessman to become the moral compass of their community. In the Parris home, Tituba was in close proximity to Betty and Abigail, Parris's daughter and niece. And these were the two girls who would become the first accusers in the witch trials. In the winter of 1692, Betty and Abigail began behaving strangely, convulsing or contorting, as bewitched people are known to do. The girls accused 3 women of being witches and causing their afflictions. These women were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. It should be no surprise that these bogus accusations were directed at 3 women of low social status. Osborne was known around town for making heretical statements, while Good was living a life of poverty and depended on others for help. For some reason, the villagers hated that. As you may know, there was a bit of a catch-22 in regards to being accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. Those who denied being witches were accused of lying, then tried, usually found guilty, then executed. And those who admitted to being witches were also tried, found guilty, and executed. Osborne and Good profusely denied these accusations, and Tituba did too at first, but she was beaten by the Reverend Samuel Parris until she offered a confession. And it's through this that Tituba cements her importance in history. This method of extracting false confessions from marginalized people would become very popular with American authorities over the next 300 years. Before Tituba's confession, only 3 people had been accused of witchcraft. But after she took the stand, the village erupted into a frenzy of investigations and accusations, leading to the execution of 20 people. On a first reading, Tituba's confession comes across as an esoteric rant full of vague references to witchcraft, magic, and the devil. Some of these references would have been recognizable to the Puritan villagers as aspects of church dogma or folklore, while other aspects might have been more tied to Afro-Caribbean beliefs or West African beliefs. It's impossible for us to know exactly what Tituba herself believed. In this confession, Tituba weaves a striking narrative of witchcraft and deviltry that only fueled the sensationalism surrounding these proceedings. Tituba tells her interrogators that upwards of 9 other people are involved, and she claims that she accompanies these people on nightly flights to Boston, presumably by broomstick. This imagery and threat of a larger witch coven caused the villagers to look past the 3 marginalized women first accused, and caused the people of Salem to begin to accuse each other. In addition, Tituba describes an encounter familiar in Puritan folklore, in which a man dressed in black with white hair from Boston forced her to sign a book in blood. It should be noted that Tituba's description of this man could very well apply to Samuel Parris himself. A coven of 9 people, a book signed in blood, midnight flights on broomstick. These are all concepts of witchcraft that the Puritan villagers would recognize from their own folk beliefs, and we should assume Tituba knew this. She knew that what she was saying would stoke the villagers' fears. Tituba ends her confession on March 1st, 1692 by exclaiming, "I am blind now, I cannot see." These words probably suggested to the Puritans that Tituba was possessed, that though she was a confessed witch, her powers were not her own. there were stronger outside forces to worry about. Throughout her confession, Tituba very carefully tiptoes the line between admitting she was a witch and denying that she has any personal powers. Elaine Breslau put it best when she says, "By locating the evil forces not only in Boston strangers, but also in the 2 Salem women arrested with her, Tituba supported the allegations. By appearing to collaborate with her own accusers, she demonstrated the correct deference to her betters." Through this deft display of brinkmanship, Tituba would avoid the fate that befell Good and Osborne and many other innocent lives. So, that's it. After exclaiming, "I am blind now, I cannot see," we lose Tituba's voice forever. We know that Tituba wasn't executed. We can say that she survived the Salem witch trials, that she beat the devil, but at what cost? Tituba was found not guilty, but remained in prison because Samuel Parris refused to pay her jail fees. After about a year, an anonymous man bought Tituba for the price of her jail fees and returned her to a life of slavery. And here we lose track of Tituba forever. We can't forget that Tituba had a family, a husband and a daughter, whom we know even less about than Tituba. Was she ever reunited with her family? We can't know. The Salem witch trials have too long been portrayed as the result of interpersonal squabbles between Puritan villagers, indicative of our modern American mentality to bring people to court over petty disputes at the drop of a hat. The absence of Tituba's voice from these portrayals is also indicative of our American mentality and culture, one which silences the weak and steps over the marginalized. So next time you open up a history book, ask yourself, who is telling this story, and whose voice is being left out of this story? Because America is not an all-inclusive melting pot. There is always someone being left out. Hey gang, I'd love to know what you thought of that video. Please leave your comments down below. Was it too zeitgeisty, too content creatory? Did it feel fresh? Did it feel stilted? I wasn't a huge fan of it, but I'd like to hear what you think. And please like and subscribe to get updates for new videos that are coming out on this channel. Thanks again. See ya.